Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, the show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang. And we just have this wonderful program and network for all of us who embrace life's second act with curiosity, passion, and a drive to connect. We are going to connect today. I promise you. Today's episode is one you won't want to miss. It's heartfelt, inspiring. It's a conversation about family, and it's especially important this time of year, but about legacy and the courage it takes to have talks inside the family that truly matter. Our guest is Yvonne K. Caputo, author of two remarkable books, Flying with Dad and Dying with Dad. Yvonne's first book, Flying with Dad, is a poignant memoir about her father, a World War II veteran whose stories of flying B-24 bombers changed their relationship forever. Part of the greatest generation, but once distant and brusque, her father became the man she truly got to know, story by story, all of his stories, mile by mile. It took a lot of time to get there, leading to a connection she never thought possible. In her second book, Yvonne Caputo has written about dying with Dad. Yvonne Caputo takes us on another intimate journey, sharing the profound and practical lessons she's learned as she's supported her father's end-of-life wishes. From navigating the powerful 5 wishes document, we're going to talk a lot about that, to ensuring he passed away on his terms. Yvonne Caputo's story reminds us of the importance of conversations about life, death, and dignity. And again, this time of year, it's all about the holiday spirit, but it's about spending time with family, quality time. You can have some of these important conversations right during these moments. And we're going to learn from Yvonne Caputo today about some of the hidden gifts that she's been able to uncover in her father's stories, how these conversations transformed her family, and why it's never too late to have the tough talks that can bring us closer to those we love. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle in, join us for this touching and inspiring episode of the Not Old Better Show here on radio and podcast. Again, I'm Paul Vogelzang, but we are talking with author Yvonne Caputo. Her two wonderful books, Flying with Dad and Dying with Dad, will be discussed at length today. You're going to love this, so join us. Yvonne Caputo, welcome to the program.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
It's nice to talk to you. Happy holidays to you and yours. This is a wonderful time of year, and I think these subjects with regard to parenting, parents, emotional forgiveness, all of these subjects are kind of on our minds today, and you've really written this wonderful book, 2 books we're going to talk about, Flying with Dad and then Dying with Dad, your most recent. And so let's start with the Flying with Dad works, because I think our audience is going to be very interested in this idea of the experiences that you shared and how some of those experiences shaped your impression. Tell us a little bit about your dad and what he meant to you, and then how you changed in your perception of him.
Dad was greatest generation.
Yeah.
There was a roof over our head and food on the table, and he was always down the hall at night, and I knew he loved me. Mm-hmm. But to have the kind of conversations, even as a teenager, about my emotional state or what was going on in school or those kinds of things, we didn't have those discussions. Dad was good with my brothers in that they could go hunting together and fishing together and watch the football games and the baseball games. And I wasn't interested in most of that stuff. So we struggled, and that lasted into my adulthood until a phone call.
Well, we'll talk about that. And certainly that's a great way to jump into another conversation kind of about this idea of generational communications, because you mentioned the greatest generation, and certainly that brings with it a demeanor, a certain way of thinking about talking to others. And some have used the term stoicism to describe some of that with that generation. Certainly it's about reservation of emotions. And so what challenges did you face, I suppose, with your dad in kind of bridging the gap of stoicism and of the reservations? Because you did have this conversation, you did have this change that really made a big difference.
When I look back, I really pin it to working on the 4th chapter of the first book, Flying with Dad.
Mm-hmm.
Dad was at Camp Miami Beach, basic training. He mentioned being billeted in a hotel. Now, stripped down, he said. There were no niceties about it. So I said, where was it? What was the name? And he said, oh, I don't remember. Do you remember where it was located? And he said, yes, on Collins Avenue and something else. And I said,
how old were you?
I was 62.
Okay. So later in life, conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, much later in life. So I started researching, because you can do anything pretty much on Google.
Right.
And I would toss a picture to him that was at the location that he said. And his email back to me was, not it. Nah, not it. On the 4th try, he said, yes, that's it. We were cadets. Great work. Love you, Dad. I didn't ask, so I don't know for sure. I'm making an assumption, but I think it shifted because he found out what links I would go to find the right hotel, what links that I would go to confirm his stories, because sometimes he said things to me I didn't believe. He was treated in Miami for amoebic dysentery with arsenic. And I said, no way. And he said, yes. And so I researched. And of course, it was true. Penicillin hadn't been developed. So doing those kinds of things where my dad liked hearing that he was right, being able to support that once again, yes, he remembered it correctly. Yes, he was right. Some things started to shift. Mm-hmm. And he started to open up more. Mm-hmm. Of course, once we got past basic training, and it took him a while to get overseas, but he started to tell me things that captured feelings. On one of his stories, when he was flying one of his first missions over Germany and France, on the way back home, back to England, they started to see flak all around him. And Dad said he watched planes go down. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, Yvonne, I was so scared, I peed myself. That's pretty intimate stuff to hear from a father. And the result, of course, was they were close to the English Channel, and he radioed to his pilot, get this bucket of bullets down when we hit the channel, because I want to freeze to death. Mm-hmm. So for your listeners, no pressurized cabins, 22,000 feet above the ground, 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So Dad was serious that they needed to come down to an altitude that he wouldn't freeze to death. So those were the kinds of stories that started to come. And we carried on with that until he started to talk about nightmares and a flashback when he came home. Now, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm really into the neurobiology of trauma. Mm-hmm. So when he told me about the nightmare, I said, well, you know, that's normal. Please excuse my father's French. What the hell do you mean? So I was able to explain the neurobiology of a nightmare and how they didn't know when he came home from war what these things were all about.
Things like PTSD and the flak in the air. Yeah.
There's no name for it. When I was explaining to Dad how normal they were and the fact that we didn't know what they were all about, I could literally hear his shoulders drop.
Wow.
To find out 60 years after the fact that what he experienced was normal. Mm-hmm. That was another part of the huge shift in my relationship with Dad. And he said to me on that conversation, how do you know this stuff? So I explained how that had just been a part of my training. Mm-hmm. The kind of what I would call up close and personal, it started to happen. It was glorious for both of us.
Yeah.
For both of us.
It started this really deep connection. And I'm sure you felt, and you touch on this a little bit, you really felt as though there was the daughter connecting with the father as opposed to the obligation of the parent being on the child.
Yes, yes.
How did that make a difference in your relationship?
We were just closer. It's hard to find the words, but he looked forward to my calling.
Yeah.
He looked forward to my driving the 6.5 hours across the state to see him. He would share things with me that perhaps I didn't even want to hear. My mother had died 7 years before, and Dad was dating, and I was fine with that. Mm-hmm. I was absolutely fine. And on one of our phone conversations, he wanted to talk about sex. And I was not going there. I mean, the closeness had become a little too real.
Right,
so
right.
I think he heard in my voice the resistance that this was just not a conversation a daughter and father were going to have.
Yes.
But it was part of what I also understand. My father was charismatic and people loved him because he was such a character and he was a storyteller. I think he was probably thinking that now he was just talking to one of the guys.
Yeah.
Not the case.
Not the case. From a professional standpoint, these stories heal, and this has healed some history in your life. And this is really something that is an important element to the book, that Flying with Dad is all about reaching a point where you can make a connection, that you can get past a bunch of stuff and really enjoy the now.
One of the things that was really clear to me, again, because I'm a therapist, when I was a child or a teenager, I'll give an example. One day I had to ask him for 35 cents so that I could go to the dance on Saturday night at the local Y. It took 3 or 4 attempts for me to go into the living room to ask him because I knew it was going to blow up. Just anger would fly. I never understood it until I could identify the PTSD.
Yeah.
All those years, he was carrying this belief that he wasn't good enough, that he wasn't man enough, and didn't understand where that anger resided inside of him, nor why it was there. I mean, he did his duty, and he didn't get into the war because of a sense of patriotism. He wanted to fly. Mm-hmm. Going into it just because he wanted to fly and then experiencing some of the horrors that he experienced, he didn't understand what that all meant because they didn't know. Mm-hmm. So I could forgive the anger. And fast forward to our very last phone conversation, he was screaming at me once again. They had released him from the hospital too soon, and he thought I caused it. So he was yelling at me. And when he finally calmed down, I said, Dad, I told them that you could go home when you're ready. Doesn't sound like you were ready. Mm-hmm. My father said to me, honey, I'm so sorry I yelled at you. And I said, Dad, you were only venting. It's okay.
Beautiful. This is a lovely story. I think all of us need that. And we need to get to this point where we can view our parents in a lot of different ways. Certainly the positive ways that you've been talking about. And my dad was Air Force, not a hero. Your dad was military, not necessarily a hero, but we can treat these unsung heroes in our families in very heroic ways. And what suggestions are you making to our audience when you talk about Flying with Dad, about getting to this point where we can preserve the legacies of ordinary heroes?
Well, the first thing I would have to say, because this is really important, some relationships with parents are toxic. And as a therapist, I've had to see children walk away. That was the only safe thing for them to do. Mm-hmm. But if that's not the case, listen, parents will give little clues. They'll start talking about old time stories. And that's the time to sit up and lean forward and say, tell me, what was that like? Asking open-ended questions. Well, who are you with? If we were more ready to do that, I believe all of us could maybe not bridge the whole gap, mm-hmm. but begin to bridge the gap. Because we're saying, in essence, to our parents in a unique kind of way, I want to know who you are. Mm-hmm. I want to know what made you. I want to know all those things in life that had something to do with who you've become. So it's finding the moment, sitting back, willing to spend the time, and listening.
Our guest today is author of 2 fantastic companion books. I'm going to call them companion books, Yvonne Caputo, because I really see them as important to read together. We will have links in our show notes today so that our audience can find out more about Yvonne Caputo's work, wonderful work, links to her books. We sure appreciate your generous time talking to us about these subjects over the holidays. I think they're important ones. And the one that I want to talk to you about next, that book that I want to talk to you about, we just wrapped up talking about flying with Dad. Let's talk about dying with Dad. I'll personalize this just slightly and tell you my own mom is 94. My 2 sisters and I are talking with her about a lot of some of these very issues that you've brought up, and you've done such a wonderful way in doing it, but maybe set the stage for how some of these questions that we all as families have to talk about as we move towards this end of life state. And it's tough to do it. It's tough to bring it up. There's a lot of emotions and you need to ignore some of the history. And that's why I thought starting with flying with Dad is a good way to make your way into some more subjects, especially about dying with Dad.
Well, at the end of my career, I worked in a retirement facility.
Yeah.
And they had a nursing wing. And I saw all too well what happened to families when an advance directive hadn't been created, or other folks call it a living will. And I was bound and determined that I didn't want that to happen with Dad. So I called him on the phone. I explained what a living will was all about. I said, are you willing to do this with me? If I make the appointment with the attorney and I come home, can we do it? And he said, yes. In the attorney's office, I could just sit back while she was the one that asked those tough questions. Fast forward maybe 6 years, I became aware of a document called the 5 Wishes. And that document is an advanced directive with heart. Yes, it names the healthcare agent. Yes, it talks about what you want and you don't want if you really become incapacitated and very ill. But it asks, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want your children to know? What kind of a funeral do you want? Do you want to be buried or do you want to be cremated? Little things.
Yeah.
And I was in trepidation because here we go again. How's my dad going to react to something like this? But luckily, when I entered his hospital room, again, driving across the state, he was in the right frame of mind. So Grace was with me. And I asked him, and we sat down, and this document asks the questions for you. If you agree to what it's suggesting, you leave it be. If you don't, you just put a line through it. And one of the questions that it asked Dad was, do you want to give your organs up when you're gone? And when we got to that one, here again, Dad said, hell no. You know, who in the world would want them? They're so old and worn out, they can't be of any use. No way. So we put a line through that. But basically, I knew everything so that when he said to me in that final call, Yvonne, I'm scared. Can you come home? I drove the next day. I was there for 2.5 hours and he was gone. However, because of all the information that I had, and because I had the legal power, Dad would say frequently, I want to go feet first out of my own home, which meant on a gurney and gone.
Yeah.
That was his way of explaining it.
Yeah.
That's exactly how it happened. And I picked up the phone and I called the hospital and I said, there's a do not resuscitate on his chart. Get it to the emergency room because they're bringing him in. But Grace was with me. And the ER doctor called the EMTs and said, you can stop working on him. So I laid down beside him. I put my arm over his chest. My mouth was near his ear. I told him that I loved him. I told him he was going to be with Mom. And then I did what was the glue in our family, the Lord's Prayer. And he was gone. They took him out of the house. And the visual is this. northwestern Pennsylvania. The snow is coming down an inch an hour. The ambulance doors were open, so the light was shining. And Dad was on the pavement on the gurney, the light on his face. There was this soft, sweet smile. And I did this. I went, yes. And the EMTs looked at me like I'd lost my only head or not a head or whatever wasn't there. And I said to them, you have done what my father wished, feet first. As a daughter, his trust in me was ultimate. He had given me the ultimate trust. And the grief journey after losing Dad is so vastly different. Talking about this, do I get a little misty-eyed? Absolutely.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
Yeah. Do I want to cook one more pot roast dinner for him? Absolutely.
Of course.
But
yeah,
I experience such a sacred joy when I think about my dad's passing. That is with me every day of my life. Joy. And for your audience to know that that could become a reality if you take this hesitant step to reach out to your parents to get those documents done.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the word that you use, grace. It's just a very powerful message. And thank you so much, Yvonne Caputo, for sharing that with us, because it really does transform this end of life period to one of joy and celebration of life as opposed to fear. And that's, I think, what we're all trying to reckon with is this fear of the unknown. But some of it doesn't have to be so unknown with this document.
The 5 Wishes comes from 5wishes.org. It's $5. I think it's recognized now in 42 states as a legal document. Fear of dying. Of course, it's a fearful kind of thing. Nobody really wants to think about it. But because of that, we create things in ourselves that we could have solved had we done it. I'll give you an example. Dad was Roman Catholic. We were sitting with Father Gramata in the office talking about the funeral mass. And my dad wanted a high mass. He wanted the incense. He wanted the organ. He wanted all of it. In this 5 Wishes, he said that my husband would sing because my husband has a glorious tenor voice. And by the way, he told me I would sing too. But my brother said, how do you know all this stuff? I said, because Dad told me. So here, going beyond the fact that he passed away in the way that he wanted, his funeral was exactly the way he wanted it. What a gift to be able to give to a parent.
I think it's a gift as well to the entire family. I know you're a grandparent. I'm a new grandparent. I think it shows the younger generation that life can have some certainty at that point. We can have some sense of positive approach. And it's through the planning that the positivity really begins. And I think that's a great lesson for grandchildren. I'm sure you're doing this very work with that.
I have 3 stories. An 87-year-old man said to his daughters, my 5 wishes is done on my birthday. I want to talk about them. That's my birthday gift. And they did. He wanted to be cremated. So they said to him, well, what do you want us to do with your ashes? And his response was, oh, just throw them over the bridge. By that time, who cares?
Yeah.
And they said, Dad, wouldn't you like them to be scattered on the farm where you grew up? And he said, oh, that's too much trouble. And they said, well, what if we want to do that for you? And he said, you really want to do that? And they said, yes. So he changed that part of the 5 wishes. A much younger woman told me that when her parents wanted to talk about it, she would shush them. Oh, no, it's too soon. We don't need to talk about it. Let's not go there. After reading the book, she went to her parents and said, I'm ready to talk. The one that brings me the most feeling is one of the women in my writers group. After she read the book, she was acutely ill, had been so for 10 years, surgery after surgery, many of them going wrong, in pain, debilitated. And she said once she did the 5 wishes with her family, they all were on board, that when she decided they would be with her. I received a call that she had chosen hospice. Her husband set it up so that we writers could have a 15-minute conversation with her. I didn't say anything for 8 minutes. She just kept saying, thank you. Thank you. My family's in agreement. They know what I want. They're ready to let me go. Thank you. What better kind of feedback can I have about the value of having those difficult conversations?
Mm-hmm. Yvonne Caputo, our guest today, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your work, Flying with Dad, Dying with Dad. We're going to put links so our audience can find out all of that information. We will make sure to link to 5wishes.org, $5 for that document, just as Yvonne points out. And we would love to have you back as you do more work on this subject, as you are thinking about this. Certainly, it's a time for our audience to be thinking about this time of year, to be celebrating with families and to just get on board with some of this. Do some planning. Think about your own 5 wishes. But Yvonne Caputo, thank you. Please come back again.
I'd love to do that. Thank you for helping me spread the word.
Yeah, the books are marvelous. The stories are just wonderful. I think the intention and some of that messaging around the 5 wishes and organizing all of this on behalf of families is equally important and valuable. That's a good word to spread.
Thanks again.
My thanks to author Yvonne K. Caputo for her generous time today and wonderful, helpful insights about end-of-life decisions, stories, and much, much more. Please check out our website, show notes, for more details about Yvonne K. Caputo and her absolutely fantastic new books. My thanks to our Smithsonian team, as well as Henhouse Consulting, for their help in making the show tip-top. My thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Be well, be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com, or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.